Well, it's time now for business, and for that I'm joined in the studio by Catherine Bennett. Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
China has just reported its GDP figures for 2020. The economy making some real gains, despite, of course, the pandemic being far from over.
That's absolutely right, and it is quite an impressive feat, both the scale of the country's recovery and also the speed of that recovery as well. China is the only major economy in the world that has managed to avoid a contraction in 2020. Gross domestic product grew 2.3% last year, and that trend is set to continue. GDP should expand at its fastest pace in a decade this year. The coronavirus outbreak effectively brought China to a standstill in the first quarter of 2020, and you can see that reflected in the figures there. The economy contracted by 6.8% in the first quarter, but it had already managed to return to growth by the second quarter, and by the final quarter of the year was up 6.5%. Earlier, we spoke to our China correspondent Charles Pellegrin, who explained how the country got back to growth.
First and foremost, what's behind this is China's decisive response to the COVID-19 pandemic on its own territory that's allowed work to resume and allowed supply chains to basically pick up where they left off. We've seen a V-shaped recovery. During the first quarter of 2020, the economy went down 6.8%, and then at the end of 2020 Q4, it went up 6.5%. And this was basically because China closed its borders and then did everything it could to stomp on any local transmission of the virus. After that, the export sector in China benefited. China is a huge producer of medical equipment and medical goods, so we've seen Chinese-made masks being exported around the world as well as other equipment. And in general, Chinese exporters have managed to gain market share on their foreign competitors, who often are still dealing with virus restrictions around the world. So really, China looking like it's coming out of this pandemic strengthened China's economy, as opposed to the rest of the world's economy that still appears to be quite weakened.
Samsung Electronics Vice Chairman Lee Jae-yong has been sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. A South Korean court convicted him of bribery, embezzlement and concealment of criminal proceeds. Lee already spent 1 year in prison back in 2017 after being convicted of playing a role in a corruption scandal that brought down the South Korean president. Lee has been the de facto head of Samsung since 2014. Samsung is the world's biggest smartphone maker and dominates business in South Korea. Its overall turnover is equivalent to a fifth of the country's GDP. Samsung shares dropped 4% after the ruling, although have since clawed back some gains. We can take a look at the markets now and how they've reacted to that news from Asia. In Europe, stocks slow out of the gate this morning. The FTSE is down 0.33%, and the CAC 40 and Germany's DAX both down around 0.5%. In Asia, Chinese stocks are up on the news of China's economic data, with the Shanghai Composite and the Hang Seng Index up by just under 1%. Stocks in Seoul, of course, plunging on the news of Lee's conviction. The Kospi Index is leading losses in the region, declining by 2.33%. In Japan, the Nikkei also down by 1%. Moving to the UK, where Britain's so-called travel corridors have been scrapped, replaced today by a much tighter set of travel restrictions. The policy is an attempt to stem the spread of coronavirus cases, but airport leaders say that it will further hurt an already struggling sector. Cole Stangler reports.
More turbulence for a sector that's seen its fair share over the last year. As of Monday, all visitors flying into the UK need to show a negative COVID test 72 hours before departure. A policy designed for health reasons, but according to an airport lobby group, one that'll make, quote, a devastating situation worse for airports facing some very difficult months ahead.
Airports are running on empty. There's only so long they can run on fumes before having to close temporarily to preserve their business for the future. Government needs to help cover airports' operational costs.
British airports have already received state aid, benefiting from deductions on last year's property taxes, but those write-offs were capped at £8 million each, leaving the bigger international hubs like London's Heathrow on the hook for much of the bills they would pay ordinarily. Last year, Britain's largest airport saw passenger traffic slump some 73%. The challenges aren't limited to the UK. According to Europe's airport lobby, some 6,000 routes have been scrapped since the onset of the health crisis, a figure that accounts for a roughly 50% drop in total routes offered. Amid the uncertainty, Heathrow has proposed hiking landing fees it charges airlines, but they too are facing heavy losses from the drop in travel.
And that wraps up the business from me.
Thank you very much, Catherine, from our business desk there.